We've got one more to close off the day, so one more panel to come. And that panel is all about accessibility in the metaverse and how to ensure that this critical development doesn't become too exclusive. And leading our panel is going to be Dan Pearson from Genvid, who you can see joining us now. And we've got a range of excellent panelists. As you can see, we've got Phil, Tracey, and we've got a few others joining us. They'll slowly come in. We'll just wait until the cameras appear, but whilst they're all appearing, I can see Dan, but I've started, so I will finish what I'm saying, which is quickly to remember to throw your questions into the Q&A as you've been doing throughout the whole Mapping the Metaverse track. And as we've got another panel here, make use of the live transcript and the subtitles, closed captioning, if that's useful to you, because it can be really good, especially the live transcript, if you want to remember who it was that said something at what time. But hi, everyone. Hi to all of our lovely panelists who are going to be closing off the show. Welcome.
Hello, everyone.
Hi there.
Like I say, normally I would do some introductions, but I think, it's right that Dan, the moderator, does that. So I am going to hand it over to you, Dan, and let you do an introduction of yourself and introduce all of the wonderful panelists. But I'll be here in the background, and I'll be here if you need me.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for sticking around and joining us for the last panel of the day. We're going to be discussing pretty broad topic in terms of accessibility for the multiverse, and that can mean a lot of things, so we're going to rattle across quite a lot of subjects relatively quickly, but if there is anything else you want us to go into more depth in at the end, just put something in the chat and we'll try and get through as many of those questions as possible. Quick introduction for me. My name's Dan Pearson. I was a journalist for many years working for gamesindustry.biz and have sort of crossed the divide 4 years ago now, I think, and I've worked for a few places since. I now work with a company called Genvid, which works with interactive streaming technology and is very much invested in the idea of the multiverse and the metaverse, and how we can best make that available to the largest number of people. I will let everyone else do their own introductions, frankly, because I'm sure you can summarize yourselves better than I can. Phil, should we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Phil Ranta. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Wormhole Labs. We're a technology company focused on building tools and platforms for the user-generated metaverse. We currently shipped a product for real estate agents to be able to do virtual open housing, and we're planning our B2C launch for this fall, where anybody with a smart device can create environments for the metaverse and then explore as an avatar. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Tracey, goodness.
Hi everyone, I'm Tracey. I'm the CEO of Ansible PR and Communications. Once upon a time, I was also on the dark side of the games industry as a journalist, like Dan. I work with Sci-Fi London, who are another guest at Beyond Games. Do check them out as well. So I've been sort of tracking the metaverse from a film and technology point of view for quite a time. As part of Ansible, I now work with technology companies to bring a voice to the metaverse as we're pickling our way through this. I'm working with Epic Games, I'm working with Polystream, and there's lots and lots of exciting stuff. I'm really looking forward to being on this panel.
Cool. Erinrose.
Hi, so I'm Erinrose. I am head of museums and cultural heritage for a company called So Real. We're based in Switzerland. And we work on the convergence of entertainment, imaging, and physics by reinventing like precision model technology for 4D plus objects. So it's really called digital twins, bringing that precision into gaming, into the metaverse, be it from an entertainment perspective, from an education perspective, from an enterprise perspective, right across the board.
I love hearing people roll up phrases like 4D plus objects. It just reminds me what an awesome set of people I get to work with. Kelly.
Yeah, so I'm a writer with Routledge. I wrote a book on interactive narratives 2-3 years ago, and I'm a lecturer in film and photography. And I originally was a software engineer, so I managed to use my technological know-how and bring it into storytelling and narrative construction. So I'm particularly interested in, and have been, in the whole idea of interactive storytelling, and particularly within the metaverses, where I see the potential. I spend most of my time trying to convince students that it is definitely going to be a thing, and that it's not just the hype. We're always looking for commercial, where's the money going to be? So which job should I definitely go for and make most money? So if I knew that, I would be in it myself.
Yeah, or at least running a recruitment consultancy. Maybe.
Yeah. Exactly. I'd be living in LA.
Okay, well, so we'll get started with a brief kind of chat about definition of exactly what we're talking about. And I don't want to get too bogged down in this because, as I discovered when kind of chatting to a few people about this panel and doing research, there are as many definitions of metaverse as people you care to ask about it. But just to kind of broadly outline what we're going to be talking about today, I think we're going to be addressing it in pretty much its kind of widest possible form here. I don't want to limit it to just the games industry. I don't want it to necessarily limit it to the archetype of what the metaverse is. It's everything involved in it, because this is potentially a technological development on the scale of the internet, and making sure that we give access to as many people as possible, from as diverse backgrounds as possible, ensure we're not setting up any barriers of financial nature or geographical nature or physical nature, is going to be paramount to ensuring that this is a equivocal and fair and open platform for everybody. So I think we are talking about the metaverse in its broadest possible definition here. I don't know if any of you have got anything to add to that, or any kind of caveats you want to make to that definition. Nope. Good.
That's great.
Good. Okay. Well, I guess the next thing to kind of make clear is the idea that this isn't just about access for users of the metaverse, right? This is very much about accessibility in terms of the creators as well. This is ensuring that we have as many people as possible who are contributing towards the construction of the metaverse, and creating of content for it, as well as being able to access it and participate in that. And that makes things several degrees more complex in some ways, but I think by ensuring a diversity and a lack of barrier to accessibility amongst creators, you are doing the first steps of ensuring accessibility for users, right? You are making sure there is relevant content for everybody. You are making sure that people's needs are considered at the very point of creation, because if you are having the people involved in that creation who are considering those needs because they are their own needs, then you are halfway to winning that kind of battle. It's obviously something that a lot of industries think about now. The games industry is going through a long process of kind of reformatting how it thinks about the people that constitute it. I don't think we're there yet by any means, but we are starting to get there. I just wondered what your thoughts were on the best ways to ensure that we are empowering people to be part of the creation of this kind of next development as well, and where we could possibly start with that.
Yeah, I'm happy. Oh, go ahead.
Go Phil, go Phil.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, luckily at Wormhole Labs, this was the problem we were trying to solve for. So I love Fortnite. I'm a lifelong gamer. I ran a gaming division at Facebook. Like, I'm all in on games. But when I looked at what the metaverse was, when it was evolving out of Minecraft and Roblox and Fortnite and all of these other things, the one thing that was missing from that is the environments were still heavily controlled by developers. And when we started thinking about how can you get anybody to create an environment, we said, well, let social media guide the way, right? Anyone's creating Instagram posts, and it's very, very, I don't want to say anyone, that's probably because, you need to have a smart device. But if you have a smart device, you can control everything. So how can we bring that into the metaverse? And that's when we came up with the idea of a smart bubble, which is you hold up your phone, you spin around in a circle, that creates a location drops into a global mesh, and then you can start exploring that global mesh and adding content to it in real time. So we like to think that although those other kind of premium metaverses are always going to be like the Marvel universe of the metaverse, and we don't want to mess with that, and that has a very special place, when it comes to a very accessible metaverse where you can add whatever you want, we wanted to look back at social media and say, what were they doing right, and what can we learn from them?
Interesting. Tracey.
For me, I think one of the key words around this is creators. It's something that certainly Epic Games, when they're referring to people who use Unreal Engine, and I work with the EMEA enterprise team at Epic, and I sit predominantly in the AEC space, and Erinrose is talking about digital twins. It's a super exciting space to be in that is born out of game engine technology. And I think what people are doing with game technology that sort of is born out of a creative muscle memory that we have from games, but now what people are innovating and doing with it as they start to blend these different verticals together, I think takes us further away from the idea of creating something for a player. And that for me is where the really exciting part about the metaverse is. And I find the conversations that we've had today as part of this conference, I think I'm hearing more and more is that we're getting to a place where we're talking about user-generated content. We're talking about content in itself as a much broader term. And when we start talking about the content in a broader term and who accesses that content, I don't think the definition of player anymore kind of fits what a metaverse audience is ultimately going to be.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Something I want to come back to later. This idea that even though gaming is probably the industry which has got the strongest idea of the metaverse so far, and it's certainly the space where it has been most strongly put forward. Gaming does not own the metaverse, and it absolutely needs to not just cooperate, but encourage other industries to take part of that. Erinrose, I'm interested to hear your perspective on how we ensure kind of a broad swathe of creators being involved. It's obviously something that art and a number of other creative industries have fought against since the kind of beginning of time. Really, how do you ensure people are able to create?
Yeah, it's interesting because we're at this, if we look at the broad lines of things right now, you kind of have three big engines out there. If you break these things up around like just taking like Unity, Unreal, and like Roblox to a certain extent, it's like these engines. And then those are their own, and they can say the metaverse, those things connecting, and like even what the idea is behind that, is that going to be in like R&D connection between these things? It's going to be a walled garden. Like I go back to, God, showing my age, it's like AOL 1996 and like the walled garden, they're going to keep you in there, and to a certain extent Apple keeping you in a world. So it's like keeping the people in there, and almost we're in this world right now. You have Unreal developers, you have Unity developers, and a certain extent, I know I forget the name of the Roblox engine, but you got those guy developers. And then even kind of like, do you live in one of these worlds? Like, are you creating across for these worlds? This is going to be interesting. Is somebody going to be able to make the link to create those things that will live across these worlds? And equally to Tracey's point of like, and this is almost keeping my gamer hat on, but if I take my, engager, my person living in this world, it's like, maybe it's where I hang out with my friends, I have a drink, maybe I do my shopping in there too. As we've heard the metaverse and fashion folks are coming, kicking and screaming, but they're coming. And it's a little bit gimmicky at the moment. I think it's funny to see Gucci sneakers and Roblox in terms of like quality brand and like look and feel in the audience. It seems to be a disconnect, but okay, people are making their tracks. But it's kind of this, there's that challenge there. I'm like, we got three worlds, the guns are out, they're all raising their money. What does that mean for the poor new creator, and how you make those bets in that, not being too cynical about that, but like, yeah, where do you begin? And I think Roblox is interesting because it started with with the kids, and they're growing up, and then you have they're trying to stay with that kid audience in the same way Minecraft in a certain extent. But then you have like Manticore saying, okay, we're going to take the older ones in, and but again, it's on that basis of games. And then I'm sure Dan will talk about it. Like if we talk about inclusivity, we're talking about worlds right now which are kind of Gen Z worlds in many ways, that we're all in it in this extent from our experience, but we're kind of still in an exceptional place too to have that connection to it. Like the real world out there, this is sci-fi stories in many ways, for a lot of folks still, and we it's familiar for us, but like as we work with other industries, you see like this is really sci-fi.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well. That kind of the barrier to entry that is just comprehension, you know, and understanding these spaces. You know, I'm 40. I already start to feel that now. You know, I pick up some games and I'm like, no, I don't have the capacity to learn this stuff anymore. And I am really feeling on the cusp of being kind of aged out by a lack of, you know, mental plasticity, I guess, to be able to kind of deal with these new concepts. So I think that's a really interesting one, and age is one of those demographics I want to come back to later in terms of that accessibility. There's some really interesting points raised there as well, I think, about the idea of creators of content versus creators of spaces. And it's easier to allow people in to create content in the same ways you spoke about with sort of social media there, but enabling people to create the spaces, enabling people to build the architecture is more difficult. Kelly, what are your kind of thoughts on how we can enable people to do both? Is it possible to really kind of democratize the creation of the fundamental structure of the metaverse, as well as the participation in it?
I suppose, I mean, I know I teach in Dundalk Institute, and we're constantly harping on about, we need a significant investment if we're going to bring everybody up to speed. I mean, it's interesting. Many years ago, I did research for the Irish government, and it was on the new media training requirements of the Irish film industry. So they were looking at new media technologies and how can the Irish film get a jump on, the rest of Europe. And we were working with the European Broadcasting Union. And one of the things that came out of it that was really interesting is that what I, after about a year of researching and talking to everybody, I said, look, the filmmakers have an advantage because filmmakers understand storytelling. And storytelling is actually quite difficult to teach, and it's quite difficult to communicate and get across. And I watch, look, I don't play games anymore. I used to play many, many years ago, and much longer than you were playing them. And you don't need to know. And I used to write games, I used to, do the whole thing. And then I just sort of moved away from that. And what I got more interested in was form and structure. So I got into sort of James Joyce, this type, just then, and Beckett and Brecht. But when I watch my son playing Fortnite, I think it's interesting, but it's that ludic type experience. To me, it is storytelling, but it's not the type of storytelling that I would be engaging with. What I'm really interested in terms of the metaverse and interactive storytelling is when you achieve that, which the key thing in any film or any story is narrative progression. The story must continually move forward. And with an interactive story, and certainly within the metaverse, there comes the stage when the story isn't moving forward. And when the story doesn't move forward, there's no immersion anymore. The immersion is broken. So when you create a reality, you immerse yourself within that reality, and you just could be reading a book and you're imagining what's the content of the book, but you're completely immersed within that reality. And what I found when I was researching the book is one of the key problems was when you come to a point of interaction or a point of user engagement, is the reality broken? Or how do you get around it? And one of the things that seemed to be to get around it was music, because music, particularly classical music and jazz music, as composers told me, by its very nature, moves forward. So the jazz music is a really good thing to use apparently in this space. So I just think it's interesting. I think certainly the barrier, I believe in Ireland anyway, the barrier is going to be government funding. It's like a 10-year, it's a bit like what they did in the UK 20 years ago when they decided that they hadn't got the same script writers anymore. They didn't have the kind of Alexander McKendrick that they had in the 60s and 70s. So they did a 10-year plan to develop script writing, skills. And then you ended up with the full Monty. And then they ended up with 4 weddings and a funeral. And that was because they did a long-term investment into developing script writers. And I think governments have to take that long-term investment. And one of the ways it could happen in Ireland is that they've been trying to decentralize government for decades, literally for the last 100 years since the formation of the state. And they can't. Everybody comes to Dublin. So it's very centralized in Dublin. But now they announced a fund last week whereby they said they would actually fund rural communities to repurpose spaces and hubs into remote working spaces and start to recruit workers. So I thought that's actually really interesting, that there's a possibility then through government intervention and government funding. And honestly, I think often all we need from the government is money. We don't need technological involvement because generally it's too far behind. But I thought that could really build that whole space so we would all be working remotely. And here Google is here and they're saying that they've already announced that a good chunk of their employees don't have to come back to work in September. They can just continue to work remotely. And Amazon's the same. We've got a lot of the big companies here that put their headquarters because of our 12.5% tax rate. So that's, I think, money, ultimately funding.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that itself raises some interesting questions in terms of how do you universalize that? You know, how do you get disparate national governments to work to the same standards, to kind of bring people together in those kind of shared spaces? I mean, the way that the internet developed was a pretty kind of, you know, rocky in parts, but actually pretty smooth process. You know, like the standards were pretty readily agreed. You know, there were obviously a few outliers in terms of access, and there still are. But generally, it was relatively smooth introduction of that as a global concept. You know, having seen that happen in my lifetime, you know, having, you know, the first computers we had at school, you know, the most advanced thing we ever had was the little physical, you know, turtle that came in. You could control it with the logo on the BBC Micro and make it draw a penis on the floor of the classroom if you were really, really lucky. But then, you know, seeing intranet and then internet coming in, I think the first time I had regular access to the internet was at university. So it's incredibly rapid how quickly that's becoming and how fundamental that education has become to pretty much everybody, and the kind of the international standards that were very quickly agreed with that. I don't know how much more complicated that becomes with a metaverse, which presumably has higher technological barriers to entry, and I guess that's probably the next big subject to cover in terms of this. It's obviously very much rooted in financial accessibility, but it is a huge thing. And it's the one thing that's kind of held back internet access to large parts of the world, is the fact that not only do individually you need to have expensive equipment to access it, but nations have to have expensive infrastructure, you know, to be able to access it. What can we do to ensure that the metaverse isn't held back by similar things, that it's not just expensive virtual reality headsets that access it, but also that it's available to access in areas that don't have particularly good local internet, that also might not have particularly good educational facilities to teach people about the fundamentals of access? It's a big question, so anyone who wants to jump in on it.
First, that's such a hard question, because even like to your point of like infrastructure and like that, like this the part, there's infrastructure and there's hardware, and then there's like those software experiences for the hardware for that situation. And even if you look, like it's taken how many, 20 years for even some sort of standardization for our cell phone, our mobile phones to be, to recharge. Like they're going through that problem right now with the electric cars. Like there's no standardization for charging of electric cars. Like that should be like, countries should have like they should all be working together saying, you guys, this is what you need to do. So like there's so many, like governments need to get involved and say, you're not getting any type of, any type of this unless you friggin' work this out. But on the side of like, yeah, there's the part that's infrastructure, and then there's that part that's that hardware in place for people. That's really, really tough, because what's happening, you've got like the Unreals that's pushing like the metahuman, and like if experience go into hyper realism, like it becomes sort of like what does that world, like if someone's definition is like it's an extension of, like the metaverse is an extension, like you are your avatar is these metahumans and your experience. Like, I mean, we create 4D plus objects. Is that necessary for all types of experiences? And like, does that create like levels, and like does that even mean like classes to that? Like that wouldn't be the intention, but then it's real. Again, we get into, you've asked a very complicated question, Dan.
I think I asked about 8 really complicated questions at once, so it wasn't really fair.
Well, I think at the root of all of it is how do you get faster adoption, which we as technologists have to worry about this in almost every field all the time, right? I was working in mobile phones back in 2006, pre-smartphone revolution, and all we would do is sit around and go, how do we get more smartphones in people's hands, right? And eventually the world was able to catch on. The iPhone came out, everything was moving. Now I feel like a lot of people in the metaverse are like, how do we get more 5G, and how do we get VR headsets, and how do we get the AR revolution coming ahead? And I've kind of taken a stance of, we've got to kind of play on the playing field we have, right? Like I don't see a world where any government is going to go buy everybody an Oculus 2, right? It's just not there. So instead we have to say, all right, what do we have access to? I think PUBG Mobile actually did a good job introducing a lot of places with low accessibility. It's a very lightweight game. it's blowing up in Southeast Asia and South America and Middle East and Northern Africa. Like there's a lot of places where that is the game and has been the game for a long time. It's because they made it lightweight enough that you can actually play it and you don't have to worry about latency issues like you do on a lot of other stuff. And I feel like the metaverse has to take the same tack is, yes, we need to build those premium experiences. There's going to be a huge market for that. And they're going to be the ones buying the expensive avatars and yeah. We need all of that, right? But what we also need is a bottoms up approach where it's like, how do we do the lighter weight version of that? How do we start habituating people into this way of thinking and communicating and get people away from the social media grind and into something more human-like, see what makes that more special, and then give a premium experience and give a lower end experience, and then have them meet in the middle when all of the hardware adoption happens.
I could not agree with you more on that one, Phil. I think how you connect things, but importantly, how you build on top of those things is going to be where we see the metaverse emerging. And I don't think we see it today, actually. If we think about, I mean, yeah, Dan, you're giving our age away, but when we think about, you know, the birth of the internet over 40 years ago, whatever, Google started out as a search engine. Amazon was a bookseller. You know, these are now have become huge, big parts of our infrastructure, and things that we do in those ecosystems, we didn't even have the words for 30 years ago, 20 years ago. So I think for me, unlocking the metaverse is going to be when we see people creating metaverse native experiences. I think it's pushed quite far into, you know, moving away from, as Kelly was saying earlier on, it's no longer a theme. This is coming. People are actually out there building the metaverse, and I think that's why we're all here. It's super exciting. But I think the moment that it unlocks is when we can seamlessly start to move between those experiences. Right now, we're seeing lots and lots of versions of the metaverse, whether it's Fortnite, whether it's Manticore, Roblox, whichever is your flavored metaverse, omniverse, oasis of the month. But you know, you go into that, you have an avatar, a lobby, again, all barriers to entry if you've never been used to entering a game environment before. And then, hey, my friend wants to join me. How do I bring my friend or my auntie to come and join me in this experience? That's a huge barrier to entry right now. And okay, we've been here. Most of the metaverse experiences we're seeing are based around events. So we've been to an event. Where do we go next? I've got to come out of it. I've got to go through a whole different metaverse experience today. I think when we start making those connections between these experiences, when we can leap from one experience to another, and people start thinking about what that creator or user journey is when we're going to really see some exciting stuff that we'll then start calling the metaverse. And we'll know we're there when we stop calling it the metaverse. It'll just be, let's meet up at such a place, or the internet, the next internet, whatever it's called.
Oh, Dan, we can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself because my dog was exploding about someone having the temerity to shut a car door in the background. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the fact that everything we see at the moment is probably going to end up just being a facet of the eventual multiverse, right? I don't think anyone has created that universal glue that sticks everyone together, right? We are yet to see that universal interface.
It's coming. It's coming.
Well, whoever gets there first is either going to be extremely rich, or, you know, the most despised person in the world, I think. And I think that kind of leads me on to one other thing I want to discuss. I think we've probably got room for one more kind of big topic before we go into the Q&A. But one of the things that's come up a few times here is this idea of, you know, who's gonna control it, who is going to create it, and what protections do we need to ensure that it doesn't become the domain of a single corporation or the domain of a single government. You know, how can we and should we be working towards a proper civic ownership of the metaverse? Is that possible? Is it necessary? Do there need to be measures in place to ensure that it doesn't end up being the property of a single company or government? Because that is potentially limiting access as much as any other factor, I think.
I think we've gone through this experience over these past 20 years where we've seen these behemoth companies develop in ways that, governments haven't gotten involved enough, quick enough to kind of, sort of tailor things or put some, laws in place. I don't think can happen again. I think everyone's a little bit too conscious of this kind of happening. Wait a second, no, we need to pull back, and we want to, sort of technology. I don't want to say it's technology for good, but actually this is supposed to enhance our lives. This is supposed to, actually bring value. And if it's going to bring value, then it has to come from a baseline where, everyone's a part of it. There is no one owner to that. I don't know what that looks like, but I have the strong sentiment that the government, there's going to have to be a work and a coordination, a very strong coordination for that.
Yeah. I think some of the work that people like TIFCA is doing, so TIFCA is, I always get it wrong, but it's the International Future Computing Association. And so, and these are the big players in this space. These are the Googles and the Amazons and the Intels and the Epics, the Unreals, the Polystreams. They're all in this space because they're looking at what that ecosystem looks like for collaborative compute. I mentioned Polystream. I'm working with them at the moment because they're approaching this problem. They're approaching this challenge as if you want to put somebody into an interactive experience, their aim is to use command streaming. So they're not limiting themselves to a GPU per player. They are using any cloud, public clouds, in order to share a link and put people directly into an experience. And I think it's those kinds of shared industry standards of sharing of cloud solutions in order to be able to run on whatever device. So we're removing, again, those barriers to entry where you need high-end devices to do stuff, where you have to be in a certain postcode in order to be able to get, a decent minimum access threshold to power and infrastructure. I think it has to, if we are going to realize the metaverse, it has to come from a collaborative effort. And I think that's going to be our biggest challenge. Who is going to determine which channel or platform I have to go to in order to engage and socialize and to be synchronous? That's not going to happen if we work in silo anymore. And I think that is, it is huge. And it's beginning to happen, and I think we're going to realize it quickly. But then I think the next challenge we're going to have is, is it enough for us to say just because we've built it, user-generated content, what people now go and build on top of it? We just gave you the tools. I think it's on all of us to consciously think about these new audiences that we're going to be bringing in, and how we pickle our way through that is what I think we need to figure out earlier before we start labeling everything as a metaverse experience.
Yeah, I think that the way to keep everybody in check is to first acknowledge that there's probably not going to be one metaverse to rule us all. At least I hope not, right? In the same way that there's the console wars every time a new generation of console comes out, and everyone goes, is Sony going to beat Microsoft, Nintendo? And they all keep building. And then sometimes a Genesis or Sega will go away and another one will come in. And yeah, you're right. I'm certainly hope it's more of that model because the competition is good. I love what's happening in the blockchain world, which is mostly rogue pirates of people who deeply, deeply care about governance being amongst the people. And Decentraland is pretty good, right? I spent a couple hours in it the other day, and it's getting there. It's not perfect. It's not Fortnite, but it's getting there. So I certainly hope that in the future there's a metaverse that you play when you're a kid, and that's a little bit of more of a safe space. And then when you're a rebellious teen, there's one that's more about meeting people and that exploration. And then there's kind of your Facebookian one as you become older, or maybe even a LinkedIn style one that's more clubhousey and around culture. Like, I think that that's right, because much like the way that you consume content, like video content, your style changes as you go through life, and that change very well matches kind of what everybody else who's going through your same generation goes through. So I'd like to think metaverses will be that way, because there'll always be a place for that kind of Roblox and Minecraft aesthetic that's super simple and fun and easy to jump on. And I think that there's a space for that more complex Fortnite. I can go shoot each other and then I can come back to a lobby and create stuff and chat. I hope so, at least.
Kelly, have you got any thoughts on that just before we move on to the Q&A?
I mean, I would have thought personally that it would have been a decentralized space. It'll be a multitude of platforms and because I'm interested in when I'm looking for news, I go across a multitude of platforms and I trust them to varying degrees. And I pick up on a piece of news on one platform and then I'll go to research it more in depth. And in a way, it's a bit like the cinema industry. There's multitude of cinema industries, and even within each cinema industry, there's fragments. So I think it'll be made up of a series of niche players. If they're competing commercially, then they'll be stealing each other's ideas and stealing each other's offerings, and they'll continue to compete commercially. But I think what you're suggesting is that it'll somehow become a single nation state, and we'll all have a single view or outlook or worldview. And I just don't see that happening just yet. I think competition drives everything. Commercial competition drives everything. I mean, I think what you're saying is, and I totally agree, and I saw it in the new media sector, years ago, is it becomes not just competitive, but you have, particularly say Microsoft. I remember looking at online broadcasting codecs in the early 2000s, and they were fabulous. And I was saying, oh, this is going to change online broadcasting. It's going to be absolutely amazing. And 6 months later, the codec vanished. And then you would hear, oh yeah, Microsoft bought that company. and the codec just disappeared. So if that continues on, then I personally, it is competition. It is legal, but it's anti-competition the same way. So I think the metaverse couldn't be any different from that. It'll be the commercial imperative will drive expansion, but the commercial imperative will also limit what it could also be. But personally, I'm just really interested in the idea of pure storytelling within that space. And it's still and storytelling within a commercial space, in other words, for companies, for brands, then for entertainment purposes, and then for education and documentary type content. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting points right there about, the idea of this kind of digital nationhood, this idea that actually that kind of potentially that fragmented experience, if it becomes something as kind of persistent and important to people as the metaverse potentially could, does that actually become a force for division then? We've all seen console wars, we've all seen the tribalism that humans kind of love to devolve into at every possible opportunity, whether that's sport or any kind of potentially dividing lines. We love to kind of separate ourselves into these weird hierarchies and tribes that essentially, like a little bit of a dust up now and then. And I think if that potentially does happen along those lines in the metaverse, then that could be a real shame. If you end up going beyond fanboyism and actually become these kind of separated tribes that are somehow unable to communicate with each other because they are separated by a industry standard, or because they are operating in a different resolution, or they're just not operating on the same platforms. I think that is, to me, the most compelling reason that we need international agreed standards and basic interface protocols that everybody adheres to, because otherwise you are going to end up with the ghettoization of certain groups of people or certain users or certain geographical areas, and that's instantly going to cut them off from the wider experience. So even if there is even if the dream of a single point of access and a single system which unifies everything is some way off, I think there is stuff that we can do now to ensure that we are not erecting barriers to that kind of digital nomadism, that kind of migration from one platform to another in that experience.
I mean, look at the timing of it as well. The metaverse has moved from trend to people building metaverse experiences, or we're attaching the metaverse, as a definition to so many things now. At the same time, whilst the elimination of cookies is happening, for so many years, all our data has been tracked. The way forward as a marketeer was personalized ads and really getting down into showing a brand to one person, a brand, the same brand to somebody else, or tailoring brands depending on which pair of eyeballs you're looking where. I mean, I feel like, certainly from a marketeer, that's an incredible space to now be in, to say, if you don't have access to that data, how do you engage and grow audiences? How are you going to remain commercial? How are you going to sell your experience when you no longer know not only who's coming in, but how many people are turning up? It's that for me, timing wise, whilst we've got the metaverse where we're talking predominantly about events at the moment and piling people into shared experiences, which, are linked and they're all online and stuff. I'm like, who's in this metaverse? Who are we? How are we going to identify ourselves? How are we going to find each other in it? And I think that's not only a really interesting commercial challenge. I think from a creator's point of view, the people that start looking at how to link those experiences together and then work out the moment of transaction, I think are the people that we're going to quickly start being fast to follow.
Makes sense. I see we've got quite a few questions. I'm not sure how strict our time limit is because technically we have gone over it already. So hopefully
the last ones, Dan. We'll just keep going.
They'll have to drag us away.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've got quite a few questions in the chat here. So I will kind of start from the top and work our way roughly through them. I mean, one of the first questions, Chris saying lights off at 8 p.m. So we got ages. Open a bottle of wine, relax, you'll be fine. So one of the first questions we got is kind of an observation really about the point about the age difference and how we kind of ensure that we are not leaving a generation behind, particularly relevant to those of us who are feeling like we might be on the cusp of that generation now, even though we're kind of quite involved in the creation of the actual tech. There's someone's kind of posited the idea that we would develop the metaverse in the same way as we have physical spaces, in the way that, alongside nightclubs, you also have quieter pubs, or you also have cafes, you also have libraries. Are we going to have segmented experiences, I guess, which target those different kind of not just age groups but preferences in that way? Is there going to be enough of a commercial push, for an example, to say here's the metaverse club for the over 60s, where you can maybe do what the over 60s club did in the little village where I grew up and sit and play dominoes or have a raffle or talk about what you've baked that week? Is there going to be enough push commercially to do that, and if not, what are the kind of obligations of the creators of the metaverse to ensure that happens if it's not on a commercial basis?
Yeah, I mean, anybody who lived through the Facebook revolution who now sees it dominated by seniors,
grandparents,
right?
exactly.
I think that habituation happens little by little, and you just say, don't worry, grandma and grandpa, here's your login and here's this. And then 5 years later, they're sharing every article and they're like commenting on every post. I think that it's kind of the same with the metaverse, and that's a UI UX struggle, right? Is like, how do we make it so you sign in like you do on Facebook, you set up your profile like you do on Facebook, instead of going to a feed, you're in a room and they recognize that that's them. And they make it very easy to maybe point and click adventure it a little bit, right? I feel like you have to take the baby steps anyways, right? Because it's just as useful for the seniors as it is for the 13-year-olds. Yeah. Right, exactly.
Well, I would just add, to in so many ways, you think my sort of critique in general would be having just experienced COVID in the United States and seeing in certain places, they're like, oh, to get your shot for people over 70, download this app and then hit refresh at 12 p.m. and then scan your IDs, both sides. And I was like, is this it? I mean, we just crossed the Rubicon here. What the hell? It was such a perversion here, my being, under 50. And I'm like, oh my God, up to... there's this, if you're having 25-year-olds creating user experiences for people over 70, just across the board, a reset has to happen, and then if you think broadly and we talk about inclusivity, I read in the Q&A, you talk about people that are, blind, hearing impaired, what do these experiences look like? Microsoft's been doing an amazing job of inclusivity and thinking broadly. Even though we have text coming across here on the screen, there's so many ways we could even be amplifying text to be actually more expressive, because in fact, we're using more text than we ever did before with subtitling, because we're on trains, we're moving here, we don't want to listen. Like, I actually watch English television with the subtitles on. I speak English. Why do I have the subtitles on? But you can almost get used to seeing it, and like kids are learning, quickly that. But my point is that broadness, that inclusivity is going to be so important. And like, not only we have to learn from the mistakes we're still making right now, into these new places.
I think it's almost inevitable, because I think the one thing that we've seen certainly over the past 12 months is that with so many more people that have adopted technology in order to stay connected, the reluctant grandparents and the small kids that have been doing homework that maybe they've having to do it on a Teams meeting or an iPad for the first time. We've now had an experience with technology that I don't think is going to go away. Surely after the pandemic, I think that ease of connection is going to lead to us having hybrid experiences. And I think if the metaverse becomes a digital extension of ourselves, I'm all for having a cup of tea in an OAP digital bingo hall. Metaverse bingo, sign me up today. I'm down for that. There's no way I should be where young people are hanging out because I'm not cool, and that should be their space. And I think it goes back to these. I think we're going to see the emergence of metaverse native experiences, and I think they will naturally segment into themes of what's cool, what's not, what's aimed at a particular age group, and it's going to be an extension of our lives, and those experiences are just going to appear where people are living their lives online.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. There's going to be a certain amount of natural organization there, just in the same way that the idea of going to a nightclub now fills me with crippling anxiety. I'm sure the idea of hanging out in a Fortnite lobby fills me with fear of being found out for being old and being getting wrecked online, basically. So yeah, I think there's going to be a certain amount of that. I think just as long as there is the provision of those spaces, and as I think right at the beginning you raised that point about Facebook being a great example of how commercial an option that actually can be, because not only do those demographics have something to offer socially, they frankly have something to offer in terms of a bottom line, and I think that's going to be sadly a deciding factor for a lot of it. But if it increases that inclusivity, then I guess all for the better. A few other questions then. So one of the more crystal ball gazy ones, but it could be a nice quick fire round, is what do you think the biggest win is going to be in the next 12 months? So I guess what's going to be the big development over the next year or so that's really going to push this idea forward, whether that's in terms of practical experience or whether that's pushing it into the public mind or crystallizing what the actual concept is going to be. Where are we going to see those big wins over the next year or so?
Quick fire round. For me, it's in-game spectating. It's being able to access game style environments without having to be a player. I think reducing those barriers to entry, getting people into these immersive experiences where they're going to make their own narratives, creating these safe spaces where people can gather socially together, and making that social synchronous is going to be, we're going to see that in the next 12 months.
Yeah, I would say the acceleration of NFT adoption in metaverse environments. I feel like once people feel like they have true ownership and agency over metaverse items, locations, avatars, that's going to be an interesting tipping point. And I think it'll help not only drive adoption, but drive stickiness.
Okay. Anyone else around that? No?
I mean, yeah, I mean, just, with these platforms, you're just going to still have more, have more spaces to create user-generated content, being their own games and bringing your friends in, and the importance for that in the gaming industry. We kind of had some bottlenecks this past year too with that need for content, so there's just going to be an overdrive to put more hands in the kids, the power in their hands. Great stuff.
Yeah, I think it, increasing that level of agency in both television and film, in that think is an interesting idea is this perspectival approach to watching TV and to interacting with stories, that you can change your perspective on the story without changing the story. Because so it's a complete, it's not a game. If it was a game, you could change the outcome. But you, like as a filmmaker, I would never make a story like that where I would allow someone else to change the outcome. I want to tell the story, but what I do think is an interesting idea is allowing a perspectival shift. So there's a few different experiments in this. There's like holographic television, then there's apparently Coronation Street have been running a beta version of this for about 3 years. There's a version of Coronation Street where you can actually change your perspective on the story. So if it cuts to the Rover's Return, you can stay in the house. But what's interesting is, do you stick with the chronology? In other words, does time stop for you, or can you go back in time? That's what it means. For me, it's a bit more like real life. Your engagement with the narrative is more like how you engage with any life experience. When you walk through a building, you only see what you see, and you come out at the end of the day and you've only had one perspective, and then someone else has had another perspective. So I like that idea of them bringing that into story, filmmaking and television, that we have agency and we can move around and experience the story from different perspectives, but without changing the story outcome.
Yeah, I think.
Dan, I think your dog's eating you again.
Again, I blame my dog. I think, yeah, that's a fascinating perspective, that idea of the change of perspective, almost coming at it from that kind of the things that interactive theatre have been doing, those kind of experiences where you go into a warehouse and everything's happening, but you only see what you're doing, and you have to come together at the end and talk to other people to get that kind of full idea of what's happening. I mean, it's certainly something that the Genvid's really tried to focus on with the miles we've been working on, the massively interactive live events, is this idea of a central experience happening, and people can view it from anywhere they want. They don't necessarily have to change what's happening, but their experience is where they have the agency, and that perspective is where they have the agency. And I think that allows an accessibility of kind, because it allows people to lean back, as well as they don't feel the pressure to influence, to make decisions, to perform, to have skill. You can just relax and observe it.
So it's more active. I think it's a more active experience, and it's more akin to Brecht's, alienation, and then Beckett's approach. And both their approach was that you don't become immersed, because I've just been researching all the various cinema industries, including India, Pakistan, and China. And from the early days of each one, the pattern was exactly the same. The technology was developed. Some entrepreneur took the technology, filmed vaudevillian content, took it around all the local towns and sold it. And then the government realized, actually, this would be quite a useful technology to get our message out. Then usually around 1905, they saw the propaganda potential, and then immediately legislated the technology, that you had to be licensed to either own a theatre, you had to be licensed to actually own the technology, to actually distribute it, and so on. And so quickly, they saw that if you can take any technology in terms of storytelling that causes immersion, that people don't think anymore, you can convince them of a lot. Whereas the interacting, the alienation, the distanciation is just there quite naturally. You're not immersed because you're doing so much, you're thinking so much. So that's what I think is really quite interesting about it in terms of storytelling. And even how we engage with brands, and how we engage in this, the metaverse space itself, that we're not going in, just being waiting to be told what to do and told what to think. We're being more critical and have that critical distance.
And I guess that kind of comes around full circle to the idea of the other side of the metaverse, which is it being imposed upon the world around us through AI. Whether when you walk past a poster, you see the same advert as somebody else, or whether there's enough data known about you to show that specific, that the idea of it bleeding out towards the real world rather than us moving in towards it as a supplement or as a replacement even for the real world. And I think there's a whole well of other conversations to be had there, and the risks and opportunities of that.
But if we go back and look at history, you can learn a lot. That's what I'm finding, looking at Beckett and looking at Brecht, and we're seeing quite a lot of ideas, and you can see, you get a sense of the pattern where it's going to go with the new technologies. And looking at the early days of cinema, how it was used and how it was exploited. And it always comes back to the commercial imperative and propaganda. There's always a form of propaganda in there somewhere.
I didn't think I was going to be on a panel discussing Brecht and Beckett, so I'm very, very happy about that, to be honest, as my first point.
I shoehorned it in.
Seriously, I'm like, yes, eat this up. Come on, this is proper culture, man. It's great. But then the flip side of that, I've literally just written down commercializing FOMO. because I think that's probably where we're going on this. You know, that as soon as you have presence and agency, and we see the speed that we can communicate with each other in social spaces, as soon as we start to connect those dots, I think that idea of FOMO is real no matter what age you are. And I think that is going to be the real interesting thing of how we deliver, how we manage, how we welcome, how we, you know, say who gets to be in and out. You know, from an accessibility point of view, that takes us full circle to go, I don't want to be the person that decides, you know, what FOMO is to somebody. We know it's a real thing, but if I make money from it, I'll buy all the gin.
And that brings around actually to the last thing I want to cover, because we are way over time now, but I've got to indulge us anyway and go into one more topic. And that's the benefits that the metaverse can possibly bring to accessibility. This idea of being able to occupy someone else's experience if you're not able to do so physically. So I know someone who was doing some work with this around this sort of idea with Google and having VR experiences of concerts and working with an autism charity for people who wanted to be able to either experience concerts or you know, films or any other kind of public experience that they might find too much in person through a VR interface, where they could, if it got too much, just take it off, or they could control the volume, or they can control the light, they could turn off any aspect of the experience in order to be able to experience it in a comfortable way. Or obviously people with mobility problems who might want to go and walk the Great Wall of China, or climb a mountain, or you know, people with phobias who want to confront something, any number of things where you can say, I want to live that experience and I am not able to do it for whatever reason. You know, somebody raised in the chat the idea of virtual travel, or access to artworks or museum collections that are on the other side of the world. All of these kind of opportunities that might be offered by the metaverse. And, you know, to try and think about a slightly more positive note about, you know, the opportunity it might offer, rather than the walls that might be put up with it. And I think obviously that's going to involve a great deal of cooperation from any number of different people and organizations as well. But I just want to close on a quick discussion of that, of where we think that the biggest potential for increasing accessibilities could lay within this technology.
Of course, that brings up the issue that if your sense of self and your identity is based on your memory, now what's happening is we have memories of things that never happened, because we're experiencing them virtually. And I remember going to New York a few years ago, and because I was worried about bringing the kids over, and I went on Google Maps and I walked around the whole place over and over and over again. And when we arrived in the evening, I got out the cab, and my wife said something about getting milk, and I just turned and pointed to the shop. And then I went, I've never been here. I've never been to New York in my whole life. Like, how did I? And so I have a memory of something that never actually happened. So I think that's a kind of an interesting thing. If our sense of self and who we see ourselves as being and who we are is based on memory, which, you know, I believe it is, how is that going to be changed by experiences within the metaverse? Because we're going to have experiences that never actually happened. Although we saw something, but it didn't actually happen, and we engaged with something that wasn't actually there.
Well, to build upon that, I remember being with my nephew in LA for the first time, and he was driving the car, and he's like, oh yeah, never been there before, but he played GTA. And he's like, yeah, I like know this.
I know, right?
It was down this road so many times, you know? And I mean, again, it was just sort of like, that was like real life. And to the other point of, like, I mean, I'm working in, you know, museums and cultural heritage. For so many, you know, when I talk with museums and all these organizations, their role in many ways has been to protect, you know, these things, not necessarily to, we say in French, just like partager, protéger, to share. And like, all of a sudden there's this, like, this past year has been like quite a traumatic experience for any type of museum or places you go to visit and experience. And I challenge, you know, obviously that first thing is, okay, we're going to be virtual, you know, we're trying to create new experiences, but I would go one step further for museums. I challenge them to, like, bring those objects into the metaverse, bring them into a game, go to where these audiences are. Like, if we look back, I said, you know, Looney Tunes, that was our first experience in Bugs Bunny and all these things. The music was classical music. That was our first experience with classical music as children. So we need to bring these types of things to in a relevant way into the metaverse, into these experiences. And it goes back to your point, Tracey, of like, you can actually sell that to a game. You know, you create these digital objects and then you can sell it. So there's like a revenue stream. So there's this virtuousness that you're creating a desire and enriching, and but as well, you know, benefiting from. And again, it kind of raises all ships. And that's sort of the utopic vision for that.
Then the archivist controls history, because if the archivist dictates it's a bit like Bradford College, their most famous student is David Hockney. And when you go to Bradford College, you would swear that the only student they had in 1953 was David Hockney, because it's the only person anyone talks about. And then I saw there, the New York Times have bought the Magnum photo archive. And if you look at Magnum was the key photo agency in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they were invited to everything. So they have the best photographs of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And it's like the New York Times now owns the 60s and the 70s and the 80s because they've all the best images. So they'll now decide what we see as a representative image and stories of that time and space. So the archivist, I always describe it as you can almost see the archivist's hand in the historical representation, because it depends who did the archive.
Yep.
So, and now it depends who tagged it. Because if you were tagging someone, what do you see this as being, and do you define it as that? And we would probably disagree from different cultures and different backgrounds. So that's another issue as well. So as this all gets brought into the metaverse, that if it's brought in one form, then it becomes really limited.
Absolutely.
I totally agree with
a single representation. It's not
I think the best opportunity we have is to not replicate experiences that we could have today. I don't think the metaverse should be a representation of what we can physically do. It gives us the chance to present museum artifacts and present film and music in completely new ways. I think that's really exciting, because that's going to bring in new audiences.
The idea of being able to kind of walk into Tutankhamun's tomb and do that first exploration yourself, or travel the rainforest, or score the winning goal in a World Cup final. All those things, we should not be limiting ourselves by saying how do we go shopping in the metaverse. I think that's
you just
important.
told us so much about yourself.
My 3 things I want to do.
You just spewed on.
Discover an Egyptian tomb, go to a jungle, be good at a sport for once. That's it. I'll be complete then. Nothing
really
too grand.
40.
And then have a nice virtual cup of tea and a sit down afterwards.
Nice. Bingo.
Petting the dog.
Back to metaverse bingo.
But thank you. I mean, I could carry on this conversation for hours. It's been fascinating, and I think we've scratched the surface of a ton of really, really interesting stuff here. But thank you all ever so much for that. I will hand back over to Sophia to wrap up for the day now, because this is the end of day one. So yeah, Sophia.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you to Phil, Tracey, Erinrose, and Kelly. Thank you to all of you for being a part of the panel, for closing off this Mapping the Metaverse in such an amazing way.